Good morning. Good morning. Good to see everybody. Very excited today. We're going to be talking about existentialism, existentialist ethics. Oh my goodness. Wow. Very exciting. So, first of all, don't expect a doctrine here, okay? Existentialist ethics is not a single unified doctrine. It's a family of approaches to life and ethics that emphasize our radical freedom as agents. And we talked a lot about this when we talked about determinism. We talked about Sartre a little bit, and we talked about the conception of radical freedom. Even if we are constrained by environmental circumstances and things beyond our control, ultimately it is up to us to define what our life means, who we are. That is our responsibility. And of course, responsibility also a big theme here. Authenticity. Authenticity has become kind of a buzzword, but in the context of existentialism, it has a profound meaning. Again, along with our radical freedom and our responsibility for determining the meaning in our life, the absurd. Man, how many of you have ever just sat down and said, this is absurd. The human condition itself is absurd. We do the same things every single day with no hope of success. Why? And Camus said, the only serious philosophical problem was suicide. That when we confront the universe in all its meaninglessness and absurdity, why do we go on? And of course, here Camus is not recommending suicide, far from it. He says we must look into that void with passion and defy the universe itself. Wow, man. And of course, value creation. We are responsible for creating the value and the meaning in our life. It's all here, all in one place, folks. It's all here. Existentialists argue that human beings are not given a fixed moral blueprint. We have no essence. There is no formula, right? We exist. We are thrown into the world. No context, no meaning. We are thrown into existence, and we have to define ourselves only later through the choices that we make. And because there are no pre-given values, we are the ones who must create the meaning in our life. And we are the ones who determine what our moral commitments are. This is extraordinary stuff. It really is. So, who are we going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at Soren Kierkegaard, also Dostoevsky a little bit. Okay, I'm going to look at those two kind of together because they're very similar in their outlook. Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. Okay, so we have a full plate today. There are people who would say, well, existentialism isn't even a doctrine. It isn't even a philosophical doctrine. And lumping these people together is doing them a disservice. But I think thematically, the philosophies of all of these thinkers are intimately connected and in a consistent way. So what are these themes? What are the themes of existentialism? Well, of course, you cannot talk about existentialism without talking about radical freedom. And really, this is the definitive characteristic of everyone who is an existentialist. this idea that we are radically free. So existentialism asserts that human beings possess complete and total radical freedom. And this is the most important insight. We each have the capacity to choose our actions, and by choosing our actions, we choose ourselves. We're choosing our character. We're giving meaning to our existence in the world. The world can't give us meaning. Anything that is external to us cannot give us meaning. We have to do that ourselves. So we each have the capacity to choose, and on the basis of those choices, we determine exactly what our life means. We have no predetermined essence. There is no blueprint. There is no plan. There is no divine law that dictates what we must be. So every moment confronts us with choices. And on the basis of those choices, we define what we are. So this freedom is absolute. And of course, that it's terrifying if you think, but there's no, like, there's no one is coming to rescue us. We face this terrible freedom alone, and it could be a burden. But even refusing to choose, to abandon our kind of obligation to choose and define the meaning of our life, that is still a choice. So our freedom is ultimately inescapable. Responsibility. Responsibility is the unavoidable consequence of our freedom. If we choose our actions and define our values, we are wholly responsible for what we become. There is no external authority we can blame, environmental circumstances, context, none of that matters. And so we must reject excuses. We cannot hide behind ideology or religion or morality, conventional morality. We cannot say it had to be this way, or I had no other choice. Now, for many of the existentialists, they take this even further. For many of the existentialists, our choices express a vision of what humanity should be. So when I choose not only for myself, but I'm choosing, like I'm saying this is the type of life that is worth living. So this makes responsibility not just personal, but universal and ethical. So yes, there is an ethics here. Authenticity. Authenticity means actively choosing one's values rather than passively absorbing them from society, from tradition, from habit. It requires seeing through the comforting illusions and mythologies, ideologies that allow us to escape our freedom. Right? We must live authentically. We must recognize that we are the only ones who can determine the meaning of our life. Now, the absurd, and here this is primarily with Camus, and the concept of absurdity. And often we think life is absurd. What do we mean by that? We think that life is absurd because we could say that life is meaningless, but there's also additionally a sense of absurdity to life. And the concept of absurdity captures the mismatch between our longing for meaning and purpose and a universe that remains completely indifferent to us. We seek coherence. We seek justification, a sense of order. We look for patterns. We look for some external sense of validation and meaning. Yet we find ourselves thrust into a black void of reality with no inherent meaning at all. And how frightening is that? And so recognizing the absurdity of life, that we take our lives so seriously, but from a perspective outside of our life, we can see that nothing at all we do has any significance or any meaning. For Camus, at least, when we get to Camus, this is not a reason for nihilism. It is not a reason for giving up. In fact, recognizing the absurd doesn't lead us to this sense of nihilism or purposelessness or meaninglessness. Rather, it demands confrontation with the human condition and a refusal to accept the false comfort of illusion. We must stare into the black void of nothingness and shake our fist and say, my life matters. And the lives of those around me matter. Why? Because I make them matter. Finally, value creation. So here the existentialist focus on creating values through our choices and commitments. We must define what matters by investing our freedom in particular projects, relationships, and goals. Again, we make those things matter. We make those things have purpose. In choosing a value, I affirm that it is worth pursuing, and in doing so, I bring meaning to an otherwise indifferent universe. Meaning is not discovered, we make it. We make it creatively. All right. Soren Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard is just a remarkable philosopher. He is a Christian, a devout Christian, but in a way, Kierkegaard recognizes the absurdity of this position in a universe that is silent. How can we maintain our faith in a universe that is completely indifferent and silent? It's an interesting question. Kierkegaard focuses on the individual, on subjectivity, and the lived experience of choosing a meaningful life in a universe that appears to be indifferent to us. Interestingly, for Kierkegaard, subjectivity is truth. Because if you think about, and go back to William James when we talked about James, and I think that we can kind of understand where Kierkegaard is coming from here, and when James was talking about faith. Because the most important truths of human existence, and you think about faith, love, commitment, meaning, these are not objective facts about the world. This is not data. Okay? These aren't data points. These aren't objective facts about the world, the things that really affect our lives. Think about being in love. You know, that's not really a factual claim. It's true, though. So subjective experience is the most important aspect of life. We have to live these things. Objective claims about the world can't tell us how to live. They're not normative. So when we talk about how should we live, this is something other than a descriptive fact. To live authentically requires passion, not intellectual speculation. And this is essential to understanding Kierkegaard, because there's limitations to what we can understand intellectually about the world. Some things just don't make sense, but are still true, right? How do we know that? Because we live those things. You can describe love, you can't make any sense of it in an objective way. You have to live it to understand it. And this is what Kierkegaard is talking about. So being human is not just a static fact, because our existence is unfinished. We are our projects. We are becoming. We are always, in a sense, becoming something that we are not. And so this is why we experience our lives in the way that we do. Life is a struggle, right? We are always in the process of becoming. We only can become ourselves through the choices that we make. And so choice is the central act that makes a person a self, not any objective collection of facts. It is through our choices that we are defined as human beings. Kierkegaard famously talks about ethics and how we come to our ethical and moral views, and how we come to embrace the ethical life. And Kierkegaard says for most people, we progress through life and we come eventually, as we mature, and initially we are fascinated by the baubles and distractions that the world provides us, but ultimately, we long for a greater sense of meaning and purpose, and we see the spiritual poverty of living a life of pleasure and novelty. And most everybody comes to that conclusion, right? At a certain point, this life of chasing pleasure and novelty is just not a satisfying life. And so then we begin to think about the type of person we want to be. And we seek structure and commitment in order to become a better person. And this is how we become ethical beings. We begin to take responsibility for our actions, and we begin to conform our behavior in accordance with duty. Now, this is all very conventional. It's good. The ethical life is good. But importantly, we have to understand that Kierkegaard is going to say that the ethical life is incomplete in a way. This is a normal stage in a human life, but it's incomplete. Well, Kierkegaard says learning to live an ethical life is good, but the ethical life by itself is not enough. It's not enough. There's something missing. The ethical life does not protect us from despair. And despair is at really the heart of the human condition, the gaping hole in our spirit that cannot be filled by anything material or even anything philosophical or ethical. Despair is the spiritual sickness that arises whenever a person tries to create themselves without God. Our genuine true self must be grounded in our relationship to God. Without that, there's a piece of us that can never be filled. And so when we attempt to ground ourselves in anything other than God, we take social roles, political ideology, personal achievements, rationality, as we're going to see with Ivan Karamazov. Remember when we talk about the brothers Karamazov, whenever we try to fill that longing, that hole in our spirit with anything other than God, we are in despair. And so despair is not merely a feeling, it is a spiritual condition. maybe the definitive spiritual condition of modernity. It's just the recognition that something in our life is missing. So despair is a condition of the soul. Despair is universal. Even if we don't experience it directly and we don't feel it, we can still be in despair. So what is required to fix this? Nothing intellectual. Despair cannot be addressed from an intellectual position. No argument, no ideology is going to work. Remember, the greatest truth about our life is a subjective truth. It has to be lived. So what needs to be done? The leap of faith. We can only become our true self through God. Only God can make our life truly meaningful. But because such a belief cannot be justified rationally, there is no apologetics here. There is no attempt to present an argument. Why? Because all arguments fail. This is something we must experience. This is something we must live. We must take a leap of faith. A passionate, inward, subjective commitment is the only grounding for ultimate meaning. You cannot do this through philosophy or science. This cannot be understood. It must be lived. So we must choose to believe, not on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of argument. We must believe despite our uncertainty. Actually, I would go even further. I would say because of the uncertainty, we must believe. We must choose to believe. And this is the only way out of despair. And we know we've seen this before, that a divine command from God transcends ethics or the ethical. Why? Because the ethical is based on rules. It's based on reason. Like think of the categorical imperative or the hedonic. Those are great. The hedonic calculus, those are great, but they're limited. Faith is a higher sphere than ethics. And the individual's absolute relationship with God can place them in a position where they must act beyond what ethics can potentially even begin to justify or explain. Ethics is about justification. Ethics is about having reasons. Faith transcends that. So a religious person must be prepared for a command from God that would take precedence over all moral and even rational obligations. Our obligations to God are not irrational, they're supra-rational. They transcend rationality. They go beyond our understanding. And so this, of course, sheds or provides us with an alternative understanding of Abraham. And so Christina says, what about the trolley situation? We wait on a command from God? No. I mean, look, Kierkegaard is not against ethics. So normally, the hedonic calculus or the categorical imperative or structuring our life in terms of character and virtue will be fine to resolve that problem. What Kierkegaard is talking about is what if God commands us, God who is transcendent commands us to pull the lever or not pull the lever. Then we suspend the ethical, even if we cannot and we will not be able to understand why. Because God's commands are supra-rational. They transcend the ability to understand. And so the more relevant situation here, Christina, is Abraham's situation. Because God tells Abraham to put Isaac on the railway tracks. Now, for Kierkegaard, and this gives us an alternative way to understand the story. Abraham is the ultimate example of one who has an absolute relationship with God. His willingness to sacrifice Isaac embodies a complete and total trust, even when God's command appears to be absurd and morally horrifying. God says, place Isaac on the railway track, Abraham. No amount of rational thinking can explain or justify that. Now, please note how Kierkegaard does not avoid this conclusion. He embraces this conclusion, which is the brilliance of Kierkegaard. This is not religious apologetics. He's not creating a structure or a meaning or trying to justify. He's simply saying, if this is what God commands, this is right. Because we're not in a position to understand what God commands. We can only have faith. So Abraham is not motivated by ethical duty. He is not motivated by personal passion. Instead, he acts out of a private inward faith that cannot be explained. It cannot be justified to anyone else. Because again, truth is subjective. Abraham cannot explain to you why he's sacrificing Isaac. But it's almost inappropriate to ask him for explanation because of what is going on. Now, to understand Abraham, we have to understand the distinction between the night of infinite resignation and the night of faith. Abraham is a knight of faith. Okay? Now, Kierkegaard admires both of these figures. They're both heroic in a way. The knight of infinite resignation is a tragic hero, and it's admirable. The knight of infinite resignation gives up what he loves most and accepts the loss completely. Think of the monk or the tragic hero. They see their existential predicament and they surrender to God's will. And they accept the loss, finding peace through renunciation and spiritual inwardness. The knight of infinite resignation understands that in this world, you cannot have what you desire. And so he reconciles himself to this loss. But Abraham is the exemplar not of the knight of infinite resignation, he is the knight of faith. He also gives up what he loves, his son, but he believes by virtue of the absurd that he will receive him back again through God. He lives in joy, not resignation, because he trusts that God will restore what seems impossible. The knight of faith trusts God absolutely, even when God's commands contradicts human reason and understanding. And this is how we should understand Abraham. Now, similarly, Dostoevsky, and we read the chapter from the Brothers Karamazov, but, you know, I did you a disservice when we talked about the Odyssey, because I didn't tell you how Dostoevsky, I told you that Dostoevsky was a devout Christian, but I didn't tell you how he resolved. I just gave you Ivan's perspective, which is overwhelming and a devastating critique of religion, and it is. And Dostoevsky acknowledges this. After all, he did write it. But I didn't tell you how Dostoevsky, as a Christian, resolves this. So to understand this, we have to understand this great phrase, right? This great line, without God, all things are permissible. And so here, Dostoevsky wrestles with this question of freedom. What do humans do with this terrifying, absolute freedom that they're burdened with? And so let's revisit this conversation between Ivan and Alyosha. And of course, we know that Ivan intellectually mops the floor with Alyosha. When Ivan demands a rational explanation for the suffering of innocent children, Alyosha cannot respond. No Christian can respond to that. Why does God create a world in which innocent children suffer? If God is omniscient and omnipotent and omnibenevolent, why would God do such a thing? Why would he create the world knowing that these children will die and suffer terrifying fates, like being ripped apart by dogs? This God is indeed a monster. Alyosha Karamazov, a true saint, really as close as a human can be, a compassionate, loving person. When Ivan asked Alyosha, would you have created paradise if the price for that creation was the death of even a single innocent child? What can he say? He can say nothing, because there is nothing to say. There is no rational justification. The question transcends the limits of reason. So Alyosha does not respond. He doesn't try to argue, because there is no argument. There is no response. There is no rational defense. And Dostoevsky recognizes this. But I didn't tell you what Alyosha does. Rather than try to formulate an argument or a justification, what does Alyosha do? He kisses his brother Ivan. An intimate gesture of Christian love and compassion, because that's all he can do. He doesn't try to defend God. He doesn't give a rational explanation for the suffering of children. He does only what he knows how to do, and that is to treat Ivan with love and compassion, a transcendent love, a transcendent compassion. This is all that Alyosha can do. Intellectually, Ivan is right. Ivan's right about many things. But Dostoevsky claims that living by reason alone, trying to live your life by reason alone, looking for justifications and rational explanations for everything, that leads us ultimately to nihilism. And this is really the message of the book. Ivan might be right, but if we take Ivan seriously, if we demand a rational explanation for everything, we end up with no meaning at all, with no purpose at all, with just a sense of absurdity and ultimately cruelty and despair. Living by reason alone leads us to nihilism, cruelty, and despair. The Christian answer to suffering is not a justification, is not a rational explanation, but rather a pure, transcendent love. Only love can make life bearable. Dostoevsky's answer is not a rational proof of God, but that meaning can only come from love, from suffering, from humility, and taking responsibilities for others. And this is exactly how Alyosha lives his life. He cannot give an answer to the theodicy. He cannot give a rational explanation as to why children must suffer. But he can only witness that suffering and bear witness to it with a sense of humility and responsibility and compassion. Our freedom is absolute. Dostoevsky recognizes this, but because our freedom is absolute, when we actually embrace this freedom, Dostoevsky claims that without God and moral responsibility, our freedom ultimately is destructive. We will use that freedom to destroy each other. When people believe that there is no justice, when people believe that there's no proof of God's existence, they face this terrifying freedom where everything now is permitted. So only through love can freedom become the path to redemption and meaning. Human beings cannot be saved by reason. True salvation comes by loving others and accepting our moral responsibility. What a book. I mean, the brothers Karamazov, my goodness. Friedrich Nietzsche. Now for Nietzsche, and Nietzsche is very, very easy to misunderstand. He is deliberately provocative and metaphorical. He uses irony. He writes in aphorisms. This makes him very easy to be misapplied and misunderstood. People interpret him as a political writer rather than an existentialist. And while his ideas do have profound political implications, Nietzsche was not interested in theory or ideology. So it's very, very, very easy to misapply what Nietzsche is doing and misunderstand what Nietzsche is doing. So we want to avoid those mistakes, and I'll try to clear up as much as I can as we go along. But there's a lot of great things here, and yes, Nietzsche is writing along these existentialist themes, right? Of freedom and responsibility and value creation. The first thing really to understand about Nietzsche is that humans, in the philosophical tradition, going all the way back, at least Plato and Socrates, in the Western philosophical tradition, humans are primarily rational creatures. Not so much for Nietzsche. The philosophical emphasis, particularly the Enlightenment emphasis on reason and dignity, are rooted in a denial of what we actually are. We are animals in the most naturalistic sense, and we are motivated by the same energies and passions as other animals. And so rationality is not the primary driver of human behavior. What drives us is what drives every other animal: the will to power. And this is the will to assert and enhance our own existence. This is the most fundamental drive in our species. It is the most fundamental drive for every species. Here's something that people misunderstand about the will to power. The will to power simply is not about domination and control. It compels us not merely to survive, but to intensify our strength and creativity. Thus, will to power is the organizing principle of Nietzsche's entire ethical project. The will to power drives us to a higher form of existence through struggle, through pain, through seeking out challenges and overcoming them. It transforms ethics from mere rule following. And here we can think of Nietzsche's disdain for Kantianism, right? It transforms ethics from mere rule following and obedience to the project of life affirming self transformation, creative self overcoming and transformation. Now, the problem that Nietzsche was addressing, or one of the problems that Nietzsche was addressing, was what he characterized as the death of God, particularly in Zarathustra, right? So what does this mean, the death of God? Well, for Nietzsche, the rationalistic ideas of the Enlightenment had undermined the sacred and the transcendental. And so we can think about the role, the explanatory role that science now plays in our life. Traditionally, when people wanted to understand being or wanted to understand themselves or the world, they looked to mythology, they looked to religion, they looked to the gods for an explanation of why things were the way they are. But with the Enlightenment, right, science has displaced religion as an explanatory mechanism. We don't need those stories of the gods. We don't need mythology. We don't need to talk about religion when we structure our lives or think about the meaning or purpose of our life. For Nietzsche, this creates a crisis because after this, there was no longer a foundation for ethical or religious values. And this could lead to nihilism. And for Nietzsche, this was a huge problem. Nihilism could eventually destroy all moral, religious, and metaphysical convictions and precipitate the greatest crisis in human history. There would be no reason to create culture. There would be no reason to create art. Nihilism, the challenge of nihilism, is a challenge that had to be overcome. And make no mistake, for Nietzsche, the descent into nihilism is unavoidable. But humanity could rebuild a value system that would transcend traditional ideas of good and evil. So we have to move beyond conventional morality and learn to create our own values. We must become the kind of beings who could make things matter. But that would be our responsibility now. We cannot go back. We cannot, return to a world in which the gods structured our existence. We could not return to a world of stories and mythologies and great heroes. We would have to create a new world of meaning. And so Nietzsche introduces the idea of the Übermensch or Overman. So Nietzsche imagined a future in which a superior being, the Übermensch, could abandon herd morality, what he characterized as the traditional morality based on good and evil, by living authentically and creating their own values. Now, this is not something that has already occurred. There are no individuals who have achieved this. What humans are now is a transitional state that will someday someday evolve into something higher. Humanism for Nietzsche was an obstacle to this evolution because of the way it removes humans from nature. Remember, humanism places humans above nature in a kind of hierarchy and institutionalizes reward and punishment. And so the kind of creativity, the radical creativity that would be necessary to develop this new type of value system would be impossible under traditional morality. So Nietzsche talks about the overman who has organized the chaos of his passions, given style to his character, and become creative. Aware of life's terrors, he affirms life without resentment. And this concept of resentment is huge for Nietzsche. And much of conventional, traditional morality is based on resentment of those who are better than you, resentment of those who are stronger than you. And so Nietzsche did not reject ethics entirely, but only ethics that were based on self-denial. Christianity, for example, Nietzsche characterized as a kind of slave morality, a value system created by people that did not have any power. And so if you don't have power, if you're at the bottom of society, and make no mistake, early Christianity arose among people who were excluded from society, who were marginalized, slaves, women, people who were left out. And so early Christianity flourished in an environment, Nietzsche argued, of resentment. So traits like strength and pride became evil. They became sins. And humility, patience, and pity became virtues. This is inverse to the Homeric creed. And think about the Iliad and the Odyssey and the story of the Trojan War and the returns and the great heroes and Arete, right? The virtues of Time and Kleos, right? Of reputation. And the songs that they would sing about strong warriors and, vanquishing your enemies. All of these virtues were turned upside down. And so suddenly strength and pride became sins, and pity and humility became virtues. So despite rejecting traditional ethics, Nietzsche argues that there are better and worse ways of living. We must respect the capacity for human flourishing and evaluate distinctions based on strength, creativity, and vitality. We must say yes to life, including our struggle, our suffering, and the contingency of human life. That's a fact we must recognize, that nothing we do is permanent. Our ethical task then is to embrace our existence fully, without resentment and without self-denial. So once we understand the historical and psychological origins of our moral values, once we understand that our traditional moral values are rooted in fear, are rooted in a sense of resentment, are rooted in self-punishment and abnegation, once we recognize that, we can begin to question their authority, and perhaps we could even think about facing life without the need of these illusions. Then Nietzsche argues that we will be radically free. And so we could create a radical new future, a future based on values we create. Now, Nietzsche has a wonderful idea here, and it's a kind of thought experiment. And it's when he talks about the love of faith, amor fati, the love of fate. What would it mean to love your fate? What would it mean to love your life and live your life with a sense of passion so complete that you would live that life over and over and over again? So here's a thought experiment. And yes, this is a thought experiment. This is not some kind of metaphysical doctrine, but it's a psychological experiment. Ask yourself this question. Would you will that your life, as you have led your life, all of your suffering, every mistake, every humiliation and misfortune that you have experienced, your life, good and bad, would you will that your life be lived again, eternally, exactly the same? What a brilliant idea this is. Every experience that you have had, you would relive over and over and over and over again, endlessly. How would you feel about that? Would you view this as a curse, damnation, or would you embrace it as a gift? The idea of eternal recurrence forces us to love our fate, to embrace our life, accepting every experience as necessary, as worthy of repetition, every experience. By accepting that every moment that we're alive matters infinitely because it returns forever. This is a way to overcome meaninglessness, nihilism. This is a way to love our life completely. Real values are not discovered. Real values are created. The will to power is not about domination. It is not. It is about creativity. The will to power is the fundamental drive towards growth and transformation. The overman is not a priest, is not a warrior. The overman is an artist. Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre is a compelling figure, very important figure in the history of philosophy, not simply in continental philosophy and existentialism, but he's a major figure. Also a great artist, a great writer of plays. Man is nothing but what he makes of himself. Human beings do not have an essence. An essence is a predefined set of characteristics. Think about a chair. A chair has an essence. A chair has a plan. A chair has a pattern. You know a chair when you see it. The essence of a chair is that it has legs, it has a back, people sit on it. We know it when we see it. Human beings, however, have no essence. There is no plan. There is no predetermined set of characteristics that make us what we are, that shapes our character. We continually determine ourselves by the choices that we make. We're the ones who determine our character. We're the ones who determine what we are. We do that continually and through choice. And so here we get Sartre's idea, radical freedom. We choose what we make ourselves to be. We are entirely responsible for our own existence. We are entirely responsible for the meaning of our life. Even in the face of external events beyond our control, doesn't Sartre realize the institutional limitations that people face? Doesn't Sartre realize that people are thrown into existence and conditions beyond their control? Yes. But even so, the meaning of our life is up to us. And we have complete control over that, who we are. We don't choose the conditions into which we are born. We don't have control over the environmental constraints that we face or the institutional challenges that are presented to us, but we do control how we respond to that. Even the person who believes in God, go back to Kierkegaard, our theist. And I think Kierkegaard would agree. At some point, even if you believe that there's a divine providence and a God, you must choose that. You must choose to believe that. And only then does it become meaningful. Now, I love this. Sartre says, even a man on death row has decisions to make, has choices to make. Even if it is just the choice to die willingly or in some sort of rebellion. Do you shake your fist at the world in anger? Do you meekly submit to the hangman's noose? What this means is up to you and up to you alone. So even a man on death row still has choices to make. We even determine the meaning of our past. Think about that. You're like, Professor, the past has already occurred. Those events have already unfolded. That may be true. But we have the power to determine what those events mean. A man who is sent to prison for a theft must choose whether that time was useful or injurious. What did that mean? I was the victim of abuse. What did that mean? I used to be a drug addict. What did that mean? Were those wasted years? Did those events make me the person that I am today? I have to choose. And I have to choose the meaning of those events in a way that structures how I respond to what is happening now. And so Sartre talks about authenticity. And authenticity is the acceptance of our radical freedom and responsibility. Because we are not predetermined like chairs or other objects, because we are not predetermined like animals, authenticity is when we recognize that our values, our projects, and identity, they are not given to us by nature. They are not given to us by society. They are created through the choices that we make every day. Now, as we talked about before, there's a price for this. There's a price for this radical freedom. This responsibility is also a burden. It's a blessing, but it's also a curse. It leads us to feel things like anguish, depression, anxiety, despair. The burden of taking complete responsibility for our choices can throw us into a state of existential anguish. And so we try to escape, we try to flee, we try to escape the hardship of having to choose all the time. Think about it. This is my responsibility alone, and I must continually choose. I am responsible for the person I am. What a burden. What a burden. It is only human to try to escape that burden by creating false narratives in which we are a victim, in which we have no control, in which we had to do the thing that we did because we had no other choice. This is a kind of lie that we tell ourselves. So we are continually trying to escape the burden of freedom. And Sartre calls this bad faith. Bad faith is pretending that we aren't free. Bad faith is pretending that we are not responsible for what we are and what we do. It is playing a role, adopting a role in which we are passive, in which we are pushed about by the currents of life, in which we have no agency and no responsibility. And this is very human and very understandable. But it is also a rejection of what we actually are. It is pretending that we are causally determined. It is seeing ourselves as a victim of circumstance or environment. It is a refusal to acknowledge what we actually are, that we are actually free and responsible for the choices that we make. Sartre gives this wonderful example: the waiter in a cafe. The waiter in the cafe moves with exaggerated gestures, overly formal politeness, and a mechanical correctness. What is going on? He is trying to be a waiter. He is a human being, but he is trying to become a waiter, as if this were a fixed identity written into his being, written into his nature. He is pretending to be a thing. He is playing a role. He is behaving as if his freedom and individuality did not exist. This is bad faith. Now, again, we're not saying that the waiter is a bad person. This is completely understandable. And think of when we adopt these social roles, and we sometimes we understand exactly what is going on. This is not me. This is not myself, but it's just easier to play this role. What are we trying to do? We're trying to escape the burden of our radical freedom. So think about societal expectations. And when we talk about Foucault, Foucault talks about how social institutions try to trap us like this, try to force us into being part of the machine, stripping away our agency and stripping away our freedom, and how we willingly go along with this. So to have truly authentic existence, Sartre tells us to stop denying our own freedom by looking to others for meaning and approval. Stop pretending that you're not free. Live according to your own beliefs and give meaning to the acts that you do. Don't try to find meaning from adopting some social role or doing what other people say. Now, Sartre also argues that we bear responsibility not only for ourselves, but for humanity as a whole. Now, I don't know exactly how successful Sartre is here, but Sartre is also very politically concerned. And he does, in his political writings, which are somewhat controversial because there was a point where Sartre embraced and endorsed Stalinism briefly, and that's its kind of own story. And so Sartre also argues that we bear responsibility not only for ourselves, but for humanity as a whole. Because when we choose for ourselves, we implicitly make a claim about what we think all humans ought to be. Ethical action then involves choosing in ways that affirm genuine freedom. So oppression, exploitation, and domination are wrong because they deny or limit the freedom that defines what it means to be human. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. I think that Simone de Beauvoir, who we're going to look at next, does this more effectively. Simone de Beauvoir. If existentialism denies fixed moral rules, objective values, and universal human essences, how can ethics be possible at all? Interesting question. Very interesting question. Her answer is an ethics that is grounded in freedom, ambiguity, and reciprocity. What a tremendous partner for Sartre in some ways and a foil in others. De Beauvoir, incredible mind. The ethics of ambiguity. Beauvoir says we must accept ambiguity as the starting point of ethics. Wow, what a radical position. We start with ambiguity. She argues that human life is fundamentally ambiguous because we're both limited by our circumstance and simultaneously we are free to choose our own meaning. So there's a kind of contradiction that's built into us at a very fundamental level. And this contradiction cannot be resolved neatly or easily. So true morality arises when we recognize that others share the same dual condition as us. So there's a recognition. And this is why I think de Beauvoir is more successful than Sartre, because she begins with the priority of recognition that others are in the same existential boat as I am in, the same existential situation. And no matter how alienated we are from others or how estranged we are, and we could be ideological rivals or religious rivals or political rivals, or we could be very angry at the other person, but there's still they could be my enemy, in fact. And there's a great part in Sophocles' play, The Ajax, when Ajax has committed suicide, and Ajax was Odysseus's enemy, and Odysseus kind of ruminates on this point that even though they were enemies, the things that connect them and bond them and bind them together as human beings, the sense of vulnerability and weakness and mortality, gives them a sense of solidarity. And I think that if we begin with this recognition that other people are in the same existential situation as we are, there's a basis for solidarity here that can be transcended. So this leads to an ethic centered on mutual liberation. My freedom only has meaning if I can also help create the conditions for others to be free as well. What a great point. So for Beauvoir, while our possibilities are always shaped by conditions beyond our control, gender roles, sexual expectations, social norms, material constraints, institutional constraints, we are never fully determined by them. We can escape. Freedom consists in transcending the constraints by taking responsibility for our choices and our projects. And so there's a nice contrast here, I think, with Foucault again, when Foucault, he when Foucault talks about this kind of intellectual or institutional determinism that can turn people into cogs in a machine. But our freedom is relational. It is not solitary. Freedom becomes meaningful only in a shared world. Genuine freedom requires acknowledging the freedom of others. Any attempt to treat others as mere objects is bad faith. True freedom requires creating meaning through action, resisting oppression, and working to expand the field of possibilities, not only for yourself, but for everyone. And de Beauvoir says one's freedom must will itself through the freedom of others. Now, there are two ways that humans attempt to flee the burden of freedom. There's the nihilist, and then there's the serious man. The nihilist tries to escape the burden of freedom by denying that values have any significance at all. Instead of taking responsibility for creating values, they conclude nothing matters. This is an escape from our responsibility. This is an attempt to avoid responsibility by pretending that all choices are equally empty. Ultimately, the nihilist collapses into passivity and negates freedom itself. Now, the serious man, this is someone who tries to escape freedom by pretending that values come from fixed external sources rather than from his own choices. Instead of accepting that he must create meaning, the serious man treats law, tradition, ideology, or moral codes as absolute, unchanging, unquestionable, refusing to acknowledge that all values are ultimately grounded in human freedom. So authenticity, true authenticity, means recognizing both one's own freedom and the freedom of others and acting in a way that affirms the shared condition, our shared existential condition, rather than trying to escape it. We must embrace responsibility for our choices, and we must commit to projects that enhance rather than diminish the freedom of others. So authenticity is a moral stance grounded in the acceptance of human complexity rather than any fixed moral law. And again, going back to this ethics of ambiguity. Now, what about feminism and ethics? For Beauvoir, every human being must be recognized as free. Every human being must be recognized as a free subject, not reduced to some type of object, not objectified, not treated as a thing. But women have historically been cast as the other. Women have been denied the conditions needed to exercise genuine freedom and moral agency. So in a truly ethical world, women would not be confined by myth, by biology, by social roles, but would instead be empowered to transcend their given situations. Beauvoir argues that we all share the ethical imperative to dismantle these oppressive structures. How can I be free if you are not? We are all responsible for creating conditions in which everybody's freedom can flourish. All right. All right. Camus, Albert Camus, Living with the Absurd. Now, here we get to the absurd. For Camus, the only serious philosophical problem was the problem of suicide. If life is meaningless, if there is no ultimate purpose, why go on living? Now, don't worry, Camus is not recommending suicide. In fact, far from it. But Camus recognizes the obvious problem is that if life ultimately has no objective meaning, why are we here? What are we doing? Does that mean that life is not worth living? So Camus' ethical view centers on how we should live in a world that is fundamentally not simply meaningless, but is absurd. A world without inherent meaning, without purpose, without a divine order. We cannot look to the universe for answers. There is nothing out there but cold indifference. It is a black void of nothingness. There is no structure. There is no blueprint. There is no guidance. Nothing loves us or cares for us. We are on our own. So we must find a way to create our own values, a way of living that recognizes the absurd without falling into illusion or despair. So his prescription is not nihilism, but a defiant, life-affirming ethics. And so we begin with a story, the myth of Sisyphus. Who was Sisyphus? We all are. Who was Sisyphus? Sisyphus was an ancient king. He was punished for his arrogance. He cheated Hades, the god of the underworld. And ultimately, Hades sent Thanatos, the personification of death, to go retrieve him. Actually, he cheated Persephone, or he tricked Persephone, who was Hades' wife, the queen of the underworld. He said, "Oh, my wife, she hasn't given me the proper burial, and I need to go reprimand her." And he did. He's very charismatic, Sisyphus was. But when death finally caught up with him, he was punished, and he was forced to roll an immense boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down, repeating this action for eternity, over and over and over again. My goodness, this sounds familiar. I get up every day. I do the same thing. I go to work. It never ends. It never stops. You know what? Is this some type of divine punishment? We never quite get to the top. We can never rest. We just keep going on and on and on in the same cycle. So Sisyphus is the ideal absurdist hero in that his punishment is representative of the human condition. We all struggle perpetually without hope of success. Folks, you will not win this game. It's rigged against you. No matter how hard you work, no matter how hard you try to achieve things, nothing will last. All things are impermanent. Everything is a chasing after the wind. Nobody wins this game. What is the way out? Nihilism? Suicide? No. Camus argues that if Sisyphus can accept that there is nothing more to life than the struggle, then he can find happiness. Wow. It's not about the accomplishments. It's not about getting to the top. It is about the struggle. It is about putting your hands on that rock every day and pushing with all your might. Camus imagined Sisyphus becoming conscious of his fate, seeing its futility, and yet continuing the struggle without appeal to illusion or false hope. He knows he's not going to win. But in that moment of lucidity, Sisyphus transforms his punishment into an act of freedom. He shakes his fist at the world, and his defiance makes him greater than his suffering. So Camus concludes with the famous line, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." The meaning of the myth is that even in a meaningless world, a world in which we are just pushing a rock endlessly up a hill every day, we can create value through persistent, conscious, and dignified resistance. Sisyphus is happy not because the universe is meaningful, but because he refuses to be defeated by its meaninglessness. So what if Sisyphus actually did construct a great tower of stone? Would that make his struggle meaningful? Well, maybe. But think about it. What happens to every tower of stone? Eventually, it collapses into rubble. So no, nothing persists. Nothing we accomplish will make any difference. It will all end up the same. Every tower that we build is destined to fall. Every tower that we build is destined to be forgotten. Time destroys everything. Empires, monuments, rulers, civilizations, everything is Ozymandias. Look upon my mighty works and quake, he says. But he is a ruin, like everything, every great ruler of the past, every great civilization of the past. It's a ruin now. So nothing we do will matter except what we do right now. Meaning exists in the struggle itself. We can begin anew. We can build a new tower. It counts only because it is there to be done, and we have the will to do it. Now, the moral life emerges not from any set of transcendent rules, but we do have to rise to the challenge of our condition, the human condition. And the human condition is one of absurdity. So instead of despair or nihilism, Camus proposes an ethic grounded in revolt, freedom, solidarity, and passion. Revolt. Revolt begins when we confront the absurd head on. Without any illusions, we just look into that black void of nothingness and shake our fist. We must commit not only to live, but to live intensely. We must remain awake rather than drifting into despair or nihilism. Look into that void, shake your fist, and say, I will live, and I will live intensely. And just as we revolt against absurdity in our own life, we must defend the dignity of others who share our condition. Again, what makes us human transcends our individual circumstance. We all face this void together. We're all in the same existential boat. This is what connects us. This is what makes us human. So revolt rejects oppression, domination, violence, murder. We must affirm life. Look, the universe is conspiring against us. We're all in this together. And if we're going to make anything out of it, we have to do that together. So we must affirm life. We must affirm freedom. We must affirm our connection with others, despite the absence of an ultimate purpose. So we are free because nothing is predetermined. And there are no transcendent rules that we have to follow. There's no blueprint. But freedom is not license. It's not a license to simply act out on every desire we have. That's not freedom, that's anarchy. We must respect the freedom of others. Why? Because we all share the same basic condition. Once we understand the absurd as a universal human condition, your suffering, your struggle, that's my concern too. This will lead to an ethics of solidarity. We are responsible to one another because we share the same fragile condition. So we must live as fully and as intensely as we can. We know that life has no ultimate meaning, and our time here is very, very, very short, very short. So we must choose to live deeply and deliberately. Passion is using our freedom to engage with what truly matters to us, not just doing what society or tradition tells us to do. All right, objection to existentialist ethics. You knew this was coming. What are the objections here? And they are numerous. And we can get caught up in the passions of talking about freedom and responsibility and choice and solidarity, but we got to come back down to earth and ask some basic questions. Does this really make any sense? Does this really make any sense? Many people charge existentialists with a type of moral relativism. So if values are simply created by individuals rather than discovered, then nothing objectively grounds moral judgments. Existentialism risks collapsing into what I choose is right for me. This makes moral problems impossible to adjudicate. It's not really even a moral theory. If I can do whatever is good for me, then how is that even a moral theory? That's just everybody having a license to act on every impulse and desire they have. Sartre says that we choose for all humanity, but critics claim that this is an unsupported leap. If values stem from individual freedom, why should, how is that compelling to other people? And yes, I mean, this is a tough one because Sartre's account of freedom, again, doesn't seem to make room for the kind of solidarity that he envisions. And that's a problem. The problem of grounding duty. Existentialists give no mechanism explaining how an individual's choice generates a universal obligation. Unlike Kant's categorical imperative or the hedonic calculus of utilitarianism, there's no meta-ethical foundation for the theory at all. And I mean, none of the existentialists really give an account of human freedom. They talk about freedom. It's a central theme, but what does it really mean? The idea of freedom in existentialism has a certain rhetorical power, but it's not fully explained. Put it that way. Excessive individualism. Existentialists characterize ethics as personal struggle, not a structured social practice. Beginning every ethical analysis with the problem of individual freedom minimizes the power of social structures, institutions, cultural norms, and material constraints on shaping choice. Again, a good foil here would be Foucault. the problem of authenticity and evil. If authenticity is the highest virtue, could an authentic sadist be morally admirable? Existentialists say no because he denies others freedom, but this seems inconsistent with the radical freedom premise. If I'm the one who determines what my life means, if authenticity means that I should simply do what I want to do, well, how can existentialism coherently forbid cruelty, selfishness, or oppression? Seems to me that that's a problem. Radical freedom in human psychology. Existentialism places tremendous weight on the individual's capacity for total self-determination. But this is psychologically unrealistic, isn't it? Sartre, for example, does not provide a mechanical explanation about how freedom works, but rather defines freedom as the inherent nature of human consciousness. Well, that's just a lot of hand waving, isn't it? If existentialists cannot explain their most fundamental idea, why should the rest of us take it seriously? I think that's a problem. I do. I think that's a pretty big problem. Okay, and then finally, can existentialism and determinism coexist? Maybe. If determinism refers to the causal structure of the universe and existentialism refers to the attitude of taking responsibility, creating values, and living authentically, then yeah, they can be reconciled. Existentialism becomes about how one responds to conditions, even if those conditions are causally determined. Even in a determined universe, humans are ultimately responsible for creating their own subjective meaning and purpose in the face of that reality. Wow, that was a lot. That was a lot, but I had fun. I hope that you did. Yeah. As always, been so great to have you guys here, and so great to be able to talk about these things with you. I do appreciate you being there, and I appreciate you hanging with me until the end. And we will continue this, and I will see you guys Thursday, and I hope that each of you has a fantastic day.